Hi everybody, my name is Skylar Smith. I'm the horticulturist here at the Big Gardens at Wash Park. It's about 3 acres, 50 beds worth of plants. Used to actually all be annuals, and we've been working over the last 7 to 9 years to transition it to perennials. And my focus over the last 3 seasons has been mostly native perennials. We're really trying to create a dense, functional habitat for pollinators and birds. I'm an ecologist by training, but have always been really into gardening and urban ecology. So this has been a really amazing experience to work with our volunteers and community members here to create something really special. It's been a big push all through Denver to add more native local plants here to support our pollinators, to use a lot less water. That's been a big push just in general as our climate's been drying out and heating up. So that's why we've been changing this whole area, and it's been really exciting to see the results. Still very much a work in progress, but I'm excited to show you guys what we've been doing around here. Really an issue in all gardens is weed suppression, taking care of weeds. And in native plantings, it can be especially difficult because when you're starting with young plants, especially natives that don't really look like much and take a while to get established, it can be really daunting to decide what's a weed, what's a native plant. So I always encourage people to help in gardens like this, to volunteer. It's a great way to learn and start to discern. So in this bed, we've got kind of an example of traditional horticulture, tons of bare soil. This used to all just be roses, but we've been filling it in with more perennials. I'll show you guys examples of some beds that are farther along later. But because there's all this bare soil, we have tons of issues with weeds. So we've been clearing out weeds here, a lot of thistles and prickly lettuce down here. You can see there's some prickly lettuce that we haven't quite gotten to yet. But in between all these roses is just tons of bare soil. And that bare soil is just an open invitation for weeds. So I'll show you guys, like I said, later on, some examples of beds that we've filled in really densely. And that really sets you up to not have to do so much weeding. But what I'm going to do now that we've cleared out the weeds is I'm just going to do a really shallow top dressing with a compost through here. That's a really great way to suppress those annual weeds. Perennials will grow right up through it, but most annual weeds really don't want to germinate when they're buried under an inch or two of compost. So that's a really great way, once you've cleared an area out, to ensure that you're not just going to have constant annual weeds, because there's just billions and billions of seeds in this soil just waiting to explode. So we're just going to bury them under that. And then we're going to go through either with seeds or with perennials that I'll pick up from the greenhouse and just fill this in. And that's going to help suppress the weeds even more, because as we like to say, plants are the best mulch. When you cover it up with plants, there really aren't that many germination sites for weeds. Okay, so here's the next step in the process. This was really weedy, and it was also filled with this goldenrod. This is a Canada goldenrod. It's a nice native species, but it really reseeds like crazy when there's bare soil, much like a lot of these plants do. So we cleared all of this out, cleared out a lot of the weeds, then covered it in mulch, and we've planted all of these kind of young perennial plants. We've got some asters in here. This is an Amsonia. It's a really great pollinator plant. We've got coneflowers. That's Indian grass, a nice native grass that will really fill in. We've already got some butterfly milkweed that have been in here, liatrices. But we like to plant pretty densely, about a foot or less in between plants, so that when they spread, all their canopies will touch, and then you're really not going to have much space in there for weeds to grow. You're going to need to weed it while they're young. You want to go through and keep it clean while the plants are small, but eventually they're all going to touch and you're not going to have to worry about it so much. So let's go take a look at one we did last year that's already filled in. Okay, so here's a planting we did last year. This bed used to be pretty much completely bare soil. There's a few roses in here. There are a few really tall grasses, and they used to just plant this with annuals. So it was just a ton of bare soil, not really much else. It really had a tendency to fill in with weeds, and it was just a lot of work. So what we did, we cleared it all out, got it so that it was completely bare soil. Then we planted, I think something like 1,000 plants in here, a bunch of little plugs, like I said, like 8 to 10 inches between them, really dense. and then we mulched with compost over that. So about an inch to an inch and a half of compost top dressing. Then I went in and seeded a grass mix. I used native grasses. I used Sidotes grama, little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass. I've got prairie drop seed in here, and on the edges, blue grama. So a really great mix of native grasses in there, and they helped fill in the gaps in between the plants. So now what you've got is basically complete canopy cover, more or less no bare soil. There's little patches in there where the plants haven't quite gotten big enough, but there's hardly any weeds in here. Occasionally I'll scout through and look for things like bindweed, make sure no thistles have germinated, but I don't really have to weed this bed much anymore. And it's going to explode this year with color. Really excited about it. We've got, I think, something like 30 different native plants in this bed, and really excited to see how it turns out. But it's a lot less maintenance than those rose beds that we have to weed just constantly. So this is the end goal for pretty much all of our beds. Before we move on, I wanted to say one more thing about this bed. Last year, when we planted it with all the tiny little native plants, they didn't really look like much, and we wanted to show people that this was going to be a colorful, showy garden with some intention behind it. So what we did when I seeded in all of these native grasses was I also seeded in a lot of native annuals. So I seeded in some Coreopsis tinctora, clasping coneflower, cosmos, yellow prairie coneflower, the Retibita, and a few others that I knew would bloom that season and give us some color so that it was showy and people could tell that it wasn't just weeds. Because, you know, when you plant native plants and they're young and you've got grasses sprouting in there, people might think that it's not being maintained. And in your yard, that might not be a big deal, especially if it's your backyard. But in your front yard, you probably want your neighbors and your community to know that you're taking care of it, so you don't have people complaining to you. And in a park, we definitely want that. So we like to show that we're taking care of it, that it's not just, you know, going wild or getting weedy. So I put in all those flowers last year. A few of them will probably come back this year, but just like with weeds, those annuals are going to have fewer and fewer germination sites as these native perennials fill in. So they're going to fade away after just a few seasons and you won't see them anymore, but they'll be taken over by all of these great perennials. Okay, here's another bed that used to be a lot of bare soil with some plants in the middle. This Baptisia, the wild blue indigo, has been in here for a while. It's pretty established, but everything around it was really just Canada thistle and a lot of annual weeds. Everyone in gardens really fears things like Canada thistle and bindweed. They tell you the only way to get rid of it is to spray it, that if you pick it, 3 more will grow in their place. And that might be true for a while, but that's just not how plants really work. If you pick them, you're eventually going to deplete those sugar resources in their roots, and you will get rid of them if you're really diligent about it. So in this bed, I just picked that Canada thistle until I hardly saw it anymore. And while I was doing that, I planted a lot of great native perennials in here. I seeded in this blue grama. That's our Colorado state grass. It's filling in a lot of bare soil, creating a really beautiful texture in here, and preventing those weeds from coming back. While I was at it in this bed, I added a ton of native plants. One thing we really want to do when we're creating native pollinator habitat is add a ton of diversity. So we've got paintbrush in here. We've got some penstemon, that's scarlet bugler penstemon. We've got butterfly milkweed. We've got Retibita, the yellow prairie coneflower, bee balm. Farther in, we've got Indian grass, a few other penstemon species. I planted a sumac, the staghorn sumac in the middle to add some shrub texture to it. So now what we've got instead of the Canada thistle is a really diverse native planting. It's not totally zero maintenance, but it's a lot less weeding than it was before. I just go through and scout and look for those weeds. It's really, really hard to permanently get rid of Canada thistle, but what you can do is establish something like this that's really dense, and then you'll just have very rare thistle. There's one that was hiding in here, and I'll just get it, and that's the only one in this bed now. So a few other sustainable weed management techniques are sheet mulching. I do a lot of that in here. I'll just bury an area. If it's like 100% weeds and it's something like bindweed or quack grass, we've got a lot of quack grass growing in here. it spreads through underground stems that are called rhizomes, and it will just spread and take over a planting. So when you see that, it's a good one to recognize and a good one to just nip in the bud. And sheet mulching can work really well for it. So something that I did here was I buried it in cardboard, and then I used all of our cutbacks from this late spring. We did that in mid to late April. Cut back and just laid the stems over it really thickly. That way any pollinators that were in the stems can still emerge when it's time to do it. And it's also helping to smother that. So it's a bit of a mix of a compost pile and our cutbacks. That way we're still leaving that material here on site for the pollinators to emerge, but it's burying a lot of the quackgrass and bindweed that was in here. And over on this side, we had a really similar situation, ton of quackgrass, a lot of bindweed. I actually dug all of this out. I couldn't probably quite get all of the bindweed roots that are like 3 or 4 feet down, but I dug that far, got all of it out, and then mounded the soil on top of it to make it even deeper over those roots. Then I covered it in even more compost, covered it in straw and twigs, and then seeded it with a native prairie mix. So it doesn't look like much yet, but there are thousands of little prairie plants germinating in there. It's very exciting. It's going to be a really dense planting. Probably by next year it'll really fill in and give some great color and pollinator habitat that replaced the quackgrass and bindweed that used to be there. And I actually haven't seen any bindweed or quackgrass pop up through this except on the very edges. So I'll just keep on top of that, pick it whenever I see it, and make sure it doesn't spread into the planting and take it over. Here's another example of farther along in the process of filling in the rose beds. Over on the other side, I was showing you where it was pretty much just roses at this point, a lot of bare soil, really no competition for the weeds. So they just fill in all that bare space because that's what they do. But over here, we started this one last year. We weeded everything out, composted it, planted a ton of native perennials. We've got a lot of echinacea in here. We've got fleabane daisy that's just starting to bloom over there. Yellow prairie coneflower, verbena, yarrow, some grasses filling in the space. And this side is a lot less weedy than the other side. One of the reasons that that is because we already mulched this one with compost. So that buried a lot of the annual weed seeds. There's still a few of them that come up through it. Got some sow thistle, a little bit of purslane here, but it's really not that much. It'll be pretty manageable. We also seeded it in with some of those native annuals. That's Coreopsis. That'll give it some color this year. The echinaceas will definitely bloom this year in their second season, but we really want to make sure it's really colorful. The roses are still here. People will still enjoy those. But as we all know, the Japanese beetles tend to kill the roses during the middle of the summer. They look nice now, but in a few weeks they're not going to. But the Japanese beetles don't bother the echinaceas or the asters or the coneflowers. So we're still going to have a lot of color in here. That diversity, that competition, it really provides a ton of benefits. It's giving us season-long color. It's distracting from the dead roses in the middle of the summer. But it's also filling in a lot of that bare soil, creating a lot more competition for space that would just be taken in by weeds. So this bed, it's really exciting. It looks a lot different than it did last year. Another thing that we like to do when we are creating habitat in these gardens is to think about how the pollinators live their life cycles. So some of our native bees are digger bees. They really like to have some bare soil, some exposed areas that they can burrow into over winter. Their little nests look kind of like an ant mound, but with a bigger hole in the middle. You might see those in your garden and think that it's ants or something, but a lot of times those are native digger bees. So in these beds, we did do the top dressing with the compost. A lot of people with native plantings don't like to use compost because our native plants kind of like leaner, more mineral soils. They don't really like a lot of compost. And sometimes if they get it, they get huge and leggy and flop all over the place. So to avoid that, people will use things like pea gravel or expanded shale. And that's great for those soils, but that doesn't really create any place for those digger bees to burrow and overwinter, create their nests. So we do, in a lot of our beds, use the compost. It's a bit of a compromise. Kind of a lot of this gardening is about compromising. It's about thinking of how can we manage weeds? How can we create something that our neighbors, our community, in this case park visitors, will really enjoy looking at, while also creating that habitat and trying to make our jobs a little easier. None of this is going to be zero maintenance, but we're all looking for balance and compromise to try to find the best way to create a beautiful garden habitat that people enjoy while also having those benefits for pollinators.